Last week, I showed you this incredible little chestnut tree that is over 100 years old. Today, I had a visitor to the forest, a very wise elder woodsman who has lived here for his whole life. And he knew the son of the man who planted this forest in the year 1906, Walter McCall, a local legend who introduced reforestation. And this forest is the one where he did his work, where he started replanting trees. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because his son, Frank McCall, lived here after his father died and left the forest to him. I can't believe there's a mosquito bothering me in the last days of October. I got him. Anyways, and my friend wandered this forest, even hunted here before I was born. And Frank McCall, the son of Walter McCall, was obviously intimately familiar with what his father had done. This gets very complicated. Let me cut to the chase first for those who are impatient, and then I'll get into details. In that first video that I did last week, I mistakenly, because I was being too conservative, thought that this was the remains of the original tree circa 1906 or thereabouts, when Walter took over this property. That was already a large tree at that time when it got the blight and died. Well, when I was showing this to my friend today, he was having a hard time wrapping his head around all of this. And so I very painstakingly uncovered the whole area here. And look at what I discovered. This, as you know, is the part that I identified before as the original. As it turns out, this is only part of that. One of its toes, if you will. Look at that bitternut hickory right there. You see how when a tree gets to a certain stature, it produces toes. It's like an elephant's foot with these big toes going into the ground. This is but one of the toes of that gigantic chestnut. And this is another. And this sucker that came up from it has come up from the center of these two toes. And the other toes are going into the soil because we're on the side of a hill. And so they've decomposed. If I was to dig this up, then I would be able to unearth them, but I don't want to disturb that. 2 toes is enough to see. And here, this solid heart of the tree. There's the solid wood. Hear that? That's the solid wood of the heart of this tree, of which these are but toes. So do you know what that means? This tree, when it got that blight around 1900, was already at least 100 years old to be this big. It's ridiculous. Back then, there were trees that were chestnut trees that were many hundreds of years old that had 6 feet spans and even more. But this one was at least a few feet, at least 100 years old. And that means if this was 100 years old in the year 1900, it's 220 years old today, at least. And this is part of it. These little suckers that came up here, 5 of them, six of them, these 6 little suckers that came up from the heart of this seemingly dead American chestnut, but it's not dead. It's still alive. This is the proof. These suckers didn't emerge from a fallen chestnut. Not that there are any other chestnut trees around here. The Miracle Sisters tree is very far from here. So, I actually told most of the story there, even though I wanted to make it shorter. I couldn't help it because this is the way that it is. This is the story. So unfortunately, impatient people who left early didn't get to find out how I know that this is over 200 years old. But now I want to show you something else that this new revelation about the grandeur, the massive size of this chestnut tree says about the rest of this forest. I'm standing beside another wonderful American chestnut that is also a sucker growing from the remains of a dead one. Obviously, this one is doing a lot better than the new discovery. But I'm only about maybe 50 meters from that one to the north. And where I'm standing here is on the edge of the property where it's connected to the neighboring property. And so this area was a tree line where farms would be divided by a strip of large trees. And so that chestnut, the giant, is also on this line, in this vicinity of the line, just further back. And I've wondered as I've been finding these chestnuts, because the Miracle Sisters chestnut way back there is also in the vicinity of this line, of this tree line, this ancient row of trees. And until now, when I discovered just how mammoth the tree was that gave rise to the new iteration of itself, the existing tree that is now sprouting anew after 100 years of dormancy. Sleep. It had a 100-year nap and now it's going again. But I wondered, because until now I had never found evidence of a giant chestnut anywhere around here. Anywhere. I've been scouring all of the forests around here. And this is the first evidence I've found of a very large specimen. And so, now I understand many things, not the least of which, in fact, the most important of which, is that that gigantic chestnut tree in this old tree line is undoubtedly the reason that Walter McCall chose this site to do his reforestation project. Imagine how he must have felt when he was looking for a place to begin reforestation and he saw this huge American chestnut in this tree line of what was otherwise barren sand waste. Because if you don't know the history of this area, at that time, this was like the Dust Bowl of the American West because of bad farming practices and clear cutting. And so everything was basically dead. That's what made him decide to do the reforestation, to try to recover the life of the land. Obviously, he was a tree lover, and the American chestnut was dying everywhere. And I imagine that one was still just hanging on to life. And he must have made it his mission to do exactly what I'm doing now with the Miracle Sisters chestnut. Gather those very few viable nuts and then replant them and take care of them and let them grow. And that's why I keep finding so many of these. This is one of the best specimens in terms of how it's doing. But it's the same thing. It's coming up from a dead one. But the dead one that it's coming up from is only maybe this big. Which makes sense, because if it was planted about 100 years ago and it died of the blight when it reached that pole size, and then up came this as one of many iterations, because it's coming from that same, let's call it a zombie. That tree that was dead, but not dead, because look what came from it. So I am overjoyed to piece together a little bit of the story of this forest and of that man, Walter McCall, and what drove him, what inspired him to begin this project that I, after it had gone fallow for some decades, have taken over and am bringing it to where it needs to be. And hopefully bringing the American chestnut back